This week's Gotcha is brought to you in part by the New York District Attorney's Office. Following news this week that Manhattan prosecutors would be convening a grand jury to investigate potential crimes by the former president and other employees of the Trump organization, I decided to address Mr. Trump directly and dig up an old politics nation standby, the memo to Trump. We had tentatively shelved this segment when you left office. But after decades of behaving as though you were somehow above the law, the legal walls finally seemed to be closing in. And it felt like a good time to once again address you directly. Let's start with a quick recap. Because even if the grand jury is new, your current alleged financial crimes seem to fit your long-held business practices. In Atlantic City, you stiffed some contractors, violated federal money laundering laws, and then in an industry with the tagline, "The house always wins," somehow you managed to bankrupt 2 casinos. And yet, you walked away with a slap on the wrist and millions of dollars. So then you cashed out and went into education, this time defrauding thousands of students hoping to learn from your fake real estate university. And while you were finally forced to close Trump University, you never faced any real legal peril and just paid a fine and walked away, this time into the White House, where you abused executive privilege and taxpayer money, fighting to hide your personal and corporate financial records for 4 years, 4 full years at that. It wasn't until you were forced out of office that those records were handed over to New York investigators. And those investigators didn't waste any time. They brought in forensic accounting experts to sift through decades of records from the Trump organization, combing through for fiscal wrongdoing. And while the district attorney's office has plenty of legal expertise, they aren't leaving anything to chance, bringing in a formal federal prosecutor with experience in white-collar and organized crime. Given your long history of financial malfeasance, it's no surprise that the New York investigators have found enough evidence to convene a special grand jury. What makes it so special? Well, apart from considering what could be the first indictment of a former president in American history, this grand jury will meet more often and for a longer period of time than a typical grand jury. With decades of evidence investigators have been forced to examine, they might need those extra weeks. So to Mr. Trump, I hear you've been lashing out ever since you heard the news about this grand jury. And that's a reasonable response if you know there are crimes they're likely to find. After all, that's a big part of the reason you were so desperate to win re-election, so intent to hide behind the shield of executive privilege that you concocted your big lie that is still tearing at the very fabric of our democracy. And by the way, even if it's new and in New York that we see in the headlines this week, your election scheming, I should say, has you under criminal investigation in Georgia, too. To borrow an old tagline from your now-defunct reality television show, the American people have already spoken, and we said, Donald, you're fired. So now you're a private citizen like the rest of us. Your fate is in the hands of the criminal justice system. And I have a feeling it's going to say what I say. I got you.